the big story of the year domestically was healthcare, obviously, and I devote a couple big chapters in the book to it. One's called Tyrannosaurus RX, and the other is called The Perfect and the Good. And the title of the second chapter on healthcare comes from something that Obama liked to say a lot, which was that, you know, while he personally might have favored a more progressive healthcare plan, ideally, that perfect objective shouldn't be the enemy of something good happening. In other words, take what you can get. Take a half loaf. Politics is the art of the possible. This partly comes out of his Chicago background, that he was going to start somewhere. But interesting, and that's what Franklin Roosevelt did in 1935 when he introduced Social Security. At the time, it was considered a very inadequate piece of legislation. It insured fewer than 40% of seniors, and it was written in a racist way so that all the occupations that blacks were in, mostly because the Southern senators insisted on this, were excluded from Social Security. And so a lot of New Dealers didn't think it was good enough. And the way you heard liberals last year saying, kill the bill, kill the bill, some liberals, wasn't good enough for them. And Roosevelt understood that you have to start somewhere. But Roosevelt waited for 2 years after he came in before he introduced Social Security. And Obama had only promised to do health care by the end of his first 4 years. He never promised that he was going to do it in year one. And by the way, he never promised there was going to be a public option. He never even used the phrase public option during the campaign. So what ended up happening is he did this and moved forward over the objections of everybody around him. And when I learned this, I was kind of stunned. Joe Biden told him, look, the public will give you a pass on this, given the economic crisis. They'll understand that you don't have to do this now. Rahm Emanuel told me, quote, I begged the president not to do this year. David Axelrod said, let's do energy first. It's more politically sensible to lead with energy. Christina Romer, the chairwoman of the Council of Economic Advisors, made the point about how she had studied Roosevelt. Roosevelt waited 2 years. Don't do this. We're trying to prevent a depression. And he decided to move ahead anyway, virtually alone in terms of his senior advisors. This was entirely hidden for all of last year. Nobody knew this. And so at the end of the year, when I was in talking to him, I asked him, so why'd you do it? And he said, well, I told Nancy Pelosi I was going to go down 10 to 15 points in the polls, as indeed he did, and he might jeopardize his reelection. So I rephrased the question, so why'd you do it, Mr. President? And he said, well, if we didn't do it now, it wouldn't happen. And his basic view was now or never, and that there was not going to be a point where he would have more political capital than he had at the beginning when he had that momentum coming in. But I got interested in, because he hadn't talked about it that much in the campaign, and I found a document from his Senate years where it wasn't even mentioned as a priority. I got interested in why he had become so committed to it, and I heard a story from one of his aides that on election night, in a quiet moment, first what happened on election night in Chicago was that Malia asked him, Dad, what are you going to do? What's the first thing you're going to do when you're president? And he said, I told you, I'm getting you and Sasha a dog. And she said, no, the first real thing. And he kind of rolls his eyes and says to David Axelrod, she's working for her school paper now. And you know, he wasn't really concerned about the very first things he was going to do. As it happened, he signed some important executive orders on his first day, and those were really his first acts. But he was thinking in a quiet moment that night, I heard later, about what's the big thing I'm going to do. And he decided that it would be health care for two reasons. One is that he just wanted to do something. thought, what's the one thing I can really do for the average American to protect them from, to give them a greater sense of security? And when you think about healthcare, you realize that in a few years we're going to look back and say, can you believe that we lived in a country where if your kid gets cancer, you have to sell your house to pay for the you know, what kind of world were we living in? It's sort of the way like we now look back at the segregation era or something. I think people will be kind of amazed that we lived in a country where people were kicked when they were down, where they had a pre-existing condition, they lose their job, that's bad enough, and then suddenly how are you going to pay for the treatment? And he'd heard so many stories like that when he was on the campaign. So some of it was that, and a lot of it was just that he thought that the fiscal future of the country was in peril if we didn't change the status quo, that the status quo was unsustainable. And his budget director, Peter Orszag, told him that if we stayed on the path we were on and didn't bend the cost curve, is the kind of fancy way they describe it, if we didn't do that, eventually 70% of all non-Pentagon spending would be for entitlements, health care of one kind or another, 70%. And then he actually said in the interview, it was 7-0, you know, and that number really stuck in his mind. So something had to be done to break the status quo, and even if this bill itself doesn't fix it by itself, it begins the process. If the bill had been defeated, then everybody would have just given up and done nothing for another 20 years. But this, in the same way Social Security was fixed, Civil Rights Act of 1957 was fixed in 1964-65. Major social legislation is always a process, but it has to begin somewhere. And so he understood that. So he walks into Axelrod's office in January of this year, and Axelrod is reading the Boston Globe online. And he says, this is from a paragraph buried in this morning's Globe. It says, when asked why she didn't want to meet more voters, Martha Coakley, who was the Democratic candidate for Ted Kennedy's seat, as you know, replied, what do you expect me to do? Shake hands in the cold outside Fenway Park? Like her opponent was doing, Scott Brown. And Fenway Park, as you know, is a shrine in Boston. And people go there to pray. So Obama, you know, understands this, and he knows immediately that it's all over, that Coakley is done, and that his dreams of his first year look like they're in tatters. And he grabs Axelrod's shirt and he says, tell me she didn't say that. Tell me she didn't say that. That cannot be true. And then they managed to recover, and I tell the story of how they eventually got it through. But that was the product of a kind of a busted play, and they won ugly, but they won. And I think the cost, though, was very high for him, as he predicted, politically, because it seemed like they had turned so much of it over to the Congress, the sausage factory, as it's called. I'm not sure that he could have avoided it, because the egos in Congress wouldn't allow him to just circumvent the committees, circumvent all the sausage making, and go right to the floor. They had a secret 800-page plan that I learned about to do that if necessary, but they probably would have lost, because the Democrats who were circumvented would have felt no ownership, and they would have voted against, as they have for the last 75 years, or most of the Republicans have voted against for the last 75 years, but the Congress hasn't passed anything, and he was getting so little cooperation from the Republicans, who were pursuing a you know, just say no politics. They messed it up, but they did end up winning, and it's something that cannot be taken away from Obama, and he now has joined Roosevelt and Johnson as a president of very significant domestic achievement, not just because of health care, but because of more than a dozen other pieces of legislation that were passed and signed while we were all busy leading our lives.